She sat down at the mahogany desk on a Tuesday morning in 1954, smoothed her skirt, uncapped her fountain pen, and began to write. The dinner party had been Saturday. The clock was already running. To understand why a woman in 1954 was writing a letter before her breakfast dishes were washed, you have to understand what post-war America had become almost overnight. Returning veterans married quickly, bought homes in new subdivisions, and built a middle class that had never existed at that scale before. Suburban neighborhoods filled up with families who were all, more or less, new to prosperity and deeply motivated to prove they belonged there. Formal entertaining was not a luxury in that world. It was how you established yourself, your household, and your family's place in the community. Here is what most people get wrong about thank you notes in the 1950s. They assume it was simply a matter of politeness, that people were gentler then, more considerate, more naturally gracious. That is a comfortable idea, but it is not accurate. The handwritten thank you note was not a suggestion. It was not an expression of individual personality. It was a functioning piece of social infrastructure, as load-bearing as a bridge and just as deliberately engineered. If you did not send the note, there were consequences, real ones, the kind that quietly rearranged your social world without a single word ever being spoken about it. One of the most important and most overlooked facts about this era is what it actually cost to mail a letter. From 1932 all the way through 1958, a first-class postage stamp cost exactly 3 cents. 3 cents. A woman did not need to be wealthy, well-connected, or particularly organized to participate in this ritual. She needed a pen, a sheet of paper, and a coin she could find in the bottom of her purse. That 3-cent stamp is what made the thank you note universal rather than aristocratic. It leveled the practice across every income bracket, in every suburb and small town in America. The impulse to put gratitude into written form is a 1950s invention, not even close. The earliest ancestors of the thank you note appear in ancient Chinese and Egyptian cultures, where messages of goodwill and friendship were pressed into papyrus and clay. These were not casual gestures. They were deliberate acknowledgments that a kindness had been received and registered, that the giver had been seen. The act of writing the thing down, of making it physical and permanent, was understood from the very beginning as something fundamentally different from simply saying thank you out loud and moving on. By the 1400s, Europeans had developed something more recognizable, the hand-delivered social note. A folded piece of paper, carried by a servant or messenger, conveying a greeting, an acknowledgment, or a formal expression of thanks between households. This was the direct ancestor of both the calling card and the greeting card, as we would come to know them. The practice was still largely confined to those who could afford paper, ink, and someone to carry the message. But the underlying logic was already fully formed. A gesture required a written response, and that response had to arrive in a timely manner. The single invention that changed everything was the postage stamp. In 1840, Great Britain introduced the penny black, the world's first adhesive postage stamp, and the effect was immediate and sweeping. For the first time, a person of ordinary means could send a written message to anyone, anywhere, without needing a servant to carry it or a wealthy patron to cover the cost. Written correspondence stopped being a privilege of the elite and became a public standard almost overnight. The thank you note, which had lived behind the walls of great houses for centuries, suddenly belonged to everyone with a penny, and something worth saying. Then came 1945, and everything accelerated. When the war ended and the men came home, American women had already spent years managing households, communities, and correspondence entirely on their own. They were extraordinarily capable. And when suburban life began in earnest, when the dinner parties and the church socials and the neighborhood gatherings started filling the calendar, these women brought their wartime discipline directly to their writing desks. The post-war surge in note writing was not accidental. It was the natural output of a generation of women who had learned, under genuine pressure, that maintaining human connection required deliberate, consistent effort. Into this world stepped Emily Post and Amy Vanderbilt, and their influence cannot be overstated. Emily Post's Etiquette book, first published in 1922, had been revised and updated through the post-war years and continued selling millions of copies well into the 1950s. Amy Vanderbilt's complete book of etiquette arrived in 1952 and sold over 90,000 copies in its first year alone. These were not coffee table books purchased for decoration. They were working references, consulted regularly, with pages turned down and passages underlined. They told women exactly what was expected, in what order, and by what deadline. The thank you note had its own chapter. It always had its own chapter. One of the clearest signs of how seriously this culture took written etiquette is what young women received as gifts at the moments that mattered most. Etiquette books were standard graduation presents. They were tucked into bridal shower gift bags alongside the monogrammed towels and the casserole dishes. A new bride was expected to own one and to use it. The gift of an etiquette book was not a gentle suggestion that the recipient needed improvement. It was a practical tool, like a good set of kitchen knives, handed down with the understanding that the world she was entering had rules, and that knowing them was not optional. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. But the etiquette book was only the formal layer. The real transmission happened at home, at the kitchen table, with a mother standing over a child who was holding a pencil and not entirely sure why. Mothers drilled the habit of note writing into their children the moment those children were old enough to form letters. A child who received a birthday gift from a relative was not allowed to simply enjoy it. Within days, she was sitting down to write a note. The mother often dictated the first few attempts. She corrected the spelling, the phrasing, the slant of the handwriting. The lesson was not about the note itself. It was about the obligation that came with receiving anything from anyone. There is a persistent and rather flattering misconception about 1950s Americans, that they wrote thank you notes because they were simply nicer people, more naturally gracious, more warmly disposed toward their neighbors. This idea lets us off the hook very conveniently. The truth is considerably more interesting. The women of the 1950s were not operating on sentiment alone. They were operating within a system that had teeth. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. Gratitude was not expressed because it felt good. It was expressed because the alternative had consequences, and those consequences were well understood by every woman who had ever watched a neighbor's invitations quietly dry up. The social consequences of failing to send a thank you note in the 1950s were real, specific, and lasting. They did not announce themselves. Nobody called to say you had been removed from the guest list. Nobody sent a formal notice that your standing in the neighborhood had shifted. What happened was quieter and more final than that. The next dinner party invitation simply did not arrive. The next bridal shower did not include your name. The hostess who had spent an afternoon preparing a meal for you remembered, with perfect clarity, that she had never heard from you afterward, and she did not extend herself again. The community contracted around you, one unreturned gesture at a time. What the thank you note actually was, underneath all its cream paper and fountain pen ink, was a piece of invisible architecture. Communities in the 1950s ran on reciprocal obligation. You invited someone to dinner. They acknowledged it. That acknowledgment signaled that they had registered the effort you made, that they valued the connection, and that they could be trusted to maintain their end of the social contract going forward. Without that signal, the whole system stalled. The note was not decoration. It was the mechanism by which a community confirmed, over and over again, that its members were paying attention to one another. Remove the mechanism, and the community does not simply become less formal. It becomes less connected. The bread and butter note deserves its own introduction because it had a specific name, a specific purpose, and a specific set of rules that were entirely separate from the gift thank you. The name itself comes from the idea that you were thanking your hostess for the most basic hospitality she could offer, the bread and butter of a meal, a bed, an evening's warmth. It was the note you wrote after a dinner party, after a weekend stay, after any occasion where someone had opened her home to you and spent her time and money making you comfortable. It was not optional. It was not a bonus gesture for particularly lovely evenings. It was mandatory, every single time without exception. The timing of the bread and butter note was not left to the writer's discretion. If you attended a dinner party on a Saturday evening, that note needed to be in the mail by Wednesday at the absolute latest. Most well-raised women aimed for Tuesday. The 48-hour rule was the informal standard, and it existed for a reason. A note that arrived 10 days after the dinner party was almost worse than no note at all, because it announced that you had thought about it, delayed it, and finally gotten around to it when you had nothing better to do. Promptness was not a bonus quality. It was the entire message. It said, "You mattered enough to be the first thing I attended to." One of the most practical gifts the 1950s etiquette tradition gave its women was the formula. The bread and butter note did not require inspiration or eloquence. It had a practiced, three-part structure that every woman knew and relied on, and that structure eliminated the blank page paralysis that stops so many people today before they even begin. You opened by acknowledging the specific occasion. You named something particular about the evening that you genuinely appreciated, and you closed with a warm, forward-looking sentiment. 3 sentences could accomplish all of it. The formula was not a crutch. It was a kindness to both the writer and the reader, a shared language that communicated everything that needed to be communicated without demanding that anyone be a poet. A common and persistent misconception is that the thank you note was primarily triggered by the receipt of a physical gift, a birthday present, a wedding gift, a Christmas package in the mail. Those absolutely required a note, without question. But the obligation extended far beyond wrapped boxes. A dinner party required a note. A weekend stay at someone's home required a note. A particularly meaningful favor, a neighbor who watched your children, a friend who drove you to an appointment. All of these were understood to be gestures that deserved written acknowledgment. The physical gift was only one of many triggers for the pen to meet the paper. Hospitality, in any form, counted. The bridal shower presented one of the most demanding note-writing obligations a young woman would ever face, and it was understood from the beginning that there were no shortcuts. Every gift received at a bridal shower required its own individual, handwritten thank you note. Every single one. Addressed by hand, personalized to the specific giver, referencing the specific gift. If 30 women attended the shower and each brought a gift, 30 notes went out, each one different, each one prompt. The bride who sent a single generic note to cover multiple givers, or who waited 3 weeks to begin, was understood to have revealed something about her character. The shower was a test she did not know she was taking. The weekend house party thank you note was its own distinct category, and it carried perhaps the heaviest social weight of all. If a family invited you to their home for an entire weekend, for a holiday gathering or a summer visit, the thank you note that followed was expected to reflect the scale of the hospitality. It needed to be longer than a dinner party note. It needed to reference specific moments from the visit, a particular meal, a walk they took together, the comfort of the guest room. Vagueness was an insult, dressed up as gratitude. The note told your hosts that you had actually been present during your stay, that you had noticed what they had done for you, and that none of it had simply washed over you unobserved. Picture a Sunday in 1954. The family has come home from church, the good wool coat is back on its hanger, the Sunday roast has been cleared from the table, and the afternoon is winding down into that particular stillness that only Sunday evenings carry. If that family had been guests at a neighbor's dinner table the day before, there was one more thing to do before the week could properly begin. The church clothes came off, The writing desk opened, and the pen was uncapped. It was as automatic as drawing the curtains at dusk. Monday morning in a 1950s household had a rhythm as fixed as a train schedule. The laundry went into the wringer washer first thing. The bread and butter note went into the mail slot second. These were not separate categories of obligation. They were the twin duties of a woman who took her household seriously. One cleaned the physical residue of the week just past, and the other cleaned the social residue, the unacknowledged kindness, the dinner that deserved a word of thanks before it faded into ordinary memory. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. Not just any paper would do. A well-raised post-war homemaker kept Crane & stationery in her desk drawer, and she kept it the way a surgeon keeps instruments, clean, organized, and ready. Crane & Co. had been making 100% cotton rag paper since 1801, and by the 1950s it was the undisputed gold standard for the American writing desk. Cotton paper has a weight and a texture that wood pulp paper simply cannot replicate. It does not yellow. It does not crinkle at the edges. It holds ink without bleeding. When you held a Crane notocard, you felt the seriousness of what you were about to do. Personalized stationery was something else entirely. To have your name or your initials engraved at the top of a note card was to announce that you took correspondence seriously enough to invest in it. It was a marker of household identity in the same quiet way that a monogrammed linen towel or a set of matched china was. It said, "This household has standards," and those standards extend all the way to the thank you note. A woman's stationery was, in a very real sense, her household's calling card in paper form. It was chosen carefully, ordered deliberately, and restocked before the last sheet was used. The fountain pen was not incidental to this ritual. It was central to it. A good fountain pen had weight in the hand, a deliberate, settled gravity that a ballpoint or a pencil simply did not carry. You could not rush a fountain pen. The nib required a certain angle, a certain pressure, a certain patience. That enforced slowness was not a flaw in the technology. It was a feature of the practice. Writing slowly meant thinking slowly, and thinking slowly meant choosing words with care. The pen shaped the tone of the note before a single word was formed. It was the instrument that turned obligation into attention. Before the recipient read a single word of a thank you note, she had already read the handwriting. In the 1950s, penmanship was a social signal as legible as a pressed suit or a clean hem. A looping, confident cursive said, "This woman was educated and unhurried." A cramped, uneven hand said something else entirely. Girls were drilled in the Palmer method of penmanship from the earliest grades, a system designed to produce smooth, rhythmic, forward-slanting script. By the time a young woman was keeping her own household, her handwriting was as much a part of her social presentation as her posture. The note announced her before she said a word. The envelope was not an afterthought. It was the first thing the recipient held, and a woman who understood correspondence knew that the envelope was part of the message. Cream stock only, never white. The address written by hand, never typed, because a typed address on a personal note was a small but readable insult. The return address in the upper left corner, not on the back flap, because the back flap was sealed with a firm, complete press that signaled the note inside was finished and considered. Nothing hanging open, nothing smudged. The envelope was the handshake before the handshake. To understand just how seriously the post-war world took the duty of written gratitude, consider a man who lived across the Atlantic Ocean and had nothing to do with American suburbia at all. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, was in the late 1940s and early 1950s a middle-aged Oxford don living under the grinding reality of British post-war rationing. Great Britain had not yet recovered from the war. Basic goods that Americans took entirely for granted were simply not available in English shops. And then the letters began to arrive from America. Not letters only, but boxes. British rationing in the early 1950s was no small inconvenience. Meat was rationed until 1954, sugar until 1953, cheese, Butter and cooking fat were controlled commodities that families measured out in ounces per week. Into this world, American fans of C.S. Lewis began mailing boxes of things that had almost become mythological in post-war Britain: canned hams, real cheese, quality pipe tobacco, and sometimes even stationery, the very paper he would use to write back. These were not luxury gifts. They were life-restoring provisions sent by strangers who had read his books and wanted to do something real in return. C.S. Lewis received these packages and did not treat the acknowledgment of them as a clerical chore to be dispatched between more important work. He sat at his desk and wrote, carefully, thoughtfully. He customized each note to the specific person, the specific gift, the specific gesture. He understood, with the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life thinking about what gratitude actually means, that the note was not about the words. It was about the act of stopping, of turning fully toward the person who had given something, and saying, I saw what you did, and it mattered to me. He treated each note as a solemn duty. What Lewis produced in those years of correspondence was something that literary scholars have since described as a minor literary genre unto itself. His thank you notes were not form letters. They were small, complete pieces of writing, warm and specific and unhurried. He mentioned the particular ham. He described what it meant to have real tobacco after months of substitutes. He asked after the sender's family by name. He did this not because he was a professional writer who could not help himself, but because he understood that a thank you note without specificity is not really a thank you note at all. It is a receipt, and a receipt is not gratitude. The C.S. Lewis example teaches something that modern psychology has since confirmed in controlled studies. The recipient of a heartfelt note does not grade it for eloquence. They do not sit with a red pen and mark your adjectives. What they feel, what they keep, what they remember years later is the warmth of the gesture. The fact that you stopped, the fact that you named the thing specifically, the fact that the note arrived at all. Lewis was not a better thank you note writer because he was a genius with language. He was a better thank you note writer because he paid full attention. And that, it turns out, is the whole skill. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Modern people who have access to unlimited paper and pens and postage and every possible word ever written as a reference are less likely to write a thank you note than a 1954 housewife who had 3 cents, a sheet of cotton paper, and a deadline. Why? Because we have convinced ourselves that we need to find the perfect words first. We freeze at the blank card. We worry it will sound awkward or insufficient, or that the recipient will read something into the phrasing that we did not intend. And so we send nothing. And nothing, it turns out, is the worst possible message. The 1950s homemaker did not freeze because she was not starting from a blank page. She was starting from a formula, a practiced, reliable 3-part structure that she had learned as a girl and had used so many times it required no more creative effort than setting the table. She knew what the first sentence would be before she sat down. She knew what the middle would do. She knew how to close. The formula did not make the note impersonal. It made the note possible. It was the scaffolding that let the warmth climb. Writer's block, as a concept, had no foothold in a practice that was structured from the start. The 3-part structure every post-war homemaker knew went like this. First, you acknowledged the specific thing, the dinner, the gift, the weekend stay. You named it. Not the lovely evening in the abstract, but the roast chicken you served on Saturday. Second, you named its value to you personally, what it meant, what it allowed, how it made you feel. Third, you expressed forward warmth, a wish for the giver, a hope to return the hospitality, a note of genuine affection for the relationship itself. 3 moves, every note. No deviation needed, no inspiration required. The structure was the gift the mother gave the daughter, and the daughter gave her own children. Specificity was not optional. It was the difference between a thank you note and a polite noise. If a neighbor brought over a blue casserole dish as a housewarming gift, the note did not say, "Thank you for the lovely gift." The note said, "The blue casserole dish is already on my stovetop and I used it for Sunday's chicken." That one sentence did three things at once. It proved you had opened the gift and actually looked at it. It proved you valued it enough to use it immediately. And it gave the giver a small, vivid picture of her gift living a real life in your real kitchen. Vagueness was a form of dismissal dressed up as politeness. Now here is the part that surprises people when they first hear it, because it sounds almost calculating, and yet it was simply the reality of how the 1950s worked. A wife's prompt, elegant thank you note to her husband's boss after a dinner party was not merely a social nicety. It was a career document. In the post-war corporate world, a man's household was considered a direct reflection of his competence, his judgment, and his character. If his wife's note arrived on time, written on good paper in a confident hand with specific and warm language, it told the boss something about the man she was married to. The parlor was an extension of the boardroom. The connection between a woman's correspondence and her husband's professional standing was not a secret or a subtext in the 1950s. It was openly discussed in etiquette books, in women's magazines, and between mothers and daughters preparing for marriage. Amy Vanderbilt's complete Book of Etiquette, published in 1952 and selling hundreds of thousands of copies, addressed the social obligations of the corporate wife with the same directness it brought to table settings and morning dress. A household that handled its social correspondence correctly was a household that could be trusted with responsibility. The note was evidence. The note was always evidence. Think of the 1950s dinner party as a professional audition that nobody acknowledged as such. The boss invited his promising employee and that employee's wife to dinner. The food was served, the conversation was managed, the evening unfolded. But the audition did not end when the guests drove home. It ended 2 days later, when the thank you note arrived or did not arrive. The note was the closing argument. It demonstrated memory, attention, warmth, and follow-through. Those are not social qualities. Those are professional qualities. The woman writing the note on Tuesday morning was, whether she thought of it this way or not, completing her husband's job interview. What did the boss's wife read into a note that arrived late, or not at all? She read everything. She read disorganization. She read ingratitude. She read a household that did not take its obligations seriously. And she told her husband, this was not gossip. This was information. In the social architecture of post-war America, the women in a community were its quality control system. They noticed who acknowledged and who did not. They remembered. The invitation list for the next dinner party was adjusted accordingly, quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. A door simply did not open again. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. The consequences were not always spoken aloud, but they were felt immediately. If a wife's note to her husband's boss never arrived, the next dinner invitation quietly did not come. The boss's wife noticed. She mentioned it to her husband over breakfast, and the husband, sitting across from that man at the Monday morning meeting, carried the knowledge that something had slipped. Not a contract, not a deadline, something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. Here is the thing that modern culture almost never acknowledges. The women who managed this correspondence were not simply being decorative. They were operating a parallel intelligence network that ran alongside the corporate world without ever entering a boardroom. They read rooms. They remembered names. They tracked relationships across months and years. The parlor was a power room. The writing desk was a strategic instrument, and the women who sat at it understood exactly what they were doing. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. Let us correct one more misconception before we go any further. There is a comfortable myth that says women in the 1950s simply knew how to behave, that good manners were somehow built into them, natural, effortless, instinctive. That is not what happened. Etiquette was taught. It was practiced. It was corrected when it went wrong. It was tested in real social situations with real consequences. The grace you observed in a well-mannered woman of that era was not an accident. It was the result of years of deliberate instruction. finishing schools formalized what mothers had already begun at home. Girls learned penmanship not as a decorative skill, but as a social obligation. Home economics classes in high schools across post-war America included correspondence as a subject alongside cooking and budgeting. You were taught the correct way to address an envelope, the proper salutation for a woman whose marital status you were uncertain of, and how many lines of text constituted a complete note versus an insulting abbreviation. These were graded skills. They were taken that seriously. But the most powerful instruction happened before any classroom. It happened at home, at the kitchen table, on a quiet afternoon, when a mother sat down to write her own notes and simply let her children watch. Children absorbed the ritual before they could articulate what it meant. They saw their mother choose the right paper. They watched her uncap the pen with care. They observed the concentration on her face, the deliberate pace of her handwriting, and they understood without being told that this was something that mattered. Watching was the first lesson. Assisting came next. Christmas was the annual examination. Every gift from every aunt, every neighbor, every family friend required its own individual note. Not a single collective letter addressed to everyone. One note per gift, one envelope per giver, each addressed by the child's own hand. Parents did not write the notes for their children and sign the child's name. That would have defeated the entire purpose. The child sat down, sometimes the day after Christmas, sometimes that same evening, and wrote until every gift had been acknowledged. It was a drill, and it worked. A child's first solo thank you note was a genuine rite of passage. It was the moment the community recognized you as a participant in the social contract, not merely a beneficiary of it. You were no longer just receiving. You were now capable of acknowledging, of returning the gesture in the only currency that mattered in polite society. Deliberate, written attention. Parents kept those early notes sometimes. Grandmothers kept them longer. They were evidence of a child crossing a threshold that had no ceremony attached to it, but was understood by everyone who witnessed it. The thank you note did not live only between individuals. It circulated through an entire web of community relationships that post-war suburban life depended on. Neighbors who brought a casserole when you were ill received a note. The church friend who drove your children to a school event received a note. The woman from the garden club who remembered your birthday with a small cutting from her rose bed received a note. These exchanges were the connective tissue of a neighborhood. Remove them, and the connections did not break immediately. They simply thinned, quietly, over time. Ladies' clubs, the PTA, church auxiliary groups, the Neighborhood Improvement Association. These organizations ran on acknowledged gestures. When a woman chaired a committee and no one wrote to thank her for the hours she had given, she noticed. When a hostess opened her home for a club meeting and received not a single note afterward, the next meeting went elsewhere. The organizational life of post-war American women was sustained by this correspondence the way a building is sustained by its foundation. Invisibly, completely, and only obviously when it was gone. The most solemn branch of the entire tradition was the sympathy note. When someone in the community lost a husband, a parent, a child, the notes that arrived in the days following were not optional. They were expected, and their absence was felt as a second wound. A sympathy note did not need to solve anything or explain anything. It needed only to say, "I know what happened. I am thinking of you, and you are not invisible in your grief." That was the entire function. And it was enough. It was more than enough. What happened to sympathy note etiquette is one of the quiet losses that grieving families feel most acutely and can least easily name. The text message that says, "So sorry for your loss," arrives in seconds and disappears into a screen within minutes. It requires nothing of the sender and leaves nothing for the recipient to hold. The handwritten note, by contrast, was a physical object. People kept them. They read them again, months later, on difficult afternoons, and felt the warmth of the original gesture reach across time. When we stopped writing them, we took something away from grief itself. The calling card was the thank you note's close cousin, and the two worked together in the social ecosystem like two instruments in the same piece of music. A calling card announced your presence. A thank you note acknowledged someone else's. Together, they formed a complete grammar of social attention. You left your card when you called on someone who was not at home. You sent your note when someone had done something for you. One said, "I thought of you." The other said, "I remember what you did." The combination made a person feel genuinely seen. The writing desk itself was not an afterthought in the post-war home. It had a specific location, usually in the living room or a small study, positioned near a window for natural light and close enough to the telephone to cross-reference addresses without leaving the chair. Its placement said something about the household's priorities. A home with a dedicated writing desk was a home that expected correspondence to happen regularly, that treated written communication as a recurring domestic function rather than an occasional inconvenience. The stationery drawer was its own small world. A well-run household kept it stocked the way a well-run kitchen kept its pantry, with variety, with readiness, with the understanding that running out at the wrong moment was a failure of planning. There were heavier sheets for formal notes, lighter cards for brief acknowledgments, plain white for condolences, and the personalized stationery for social correspondence between equals. Stamps were kept in a small book in the upper right corner of the drawer. Readiness was a form of respect. Being prepared to write meant you were prepared to notice. Modern psychology eventually caught up to what the 1950s homemaker had been practicing at her writing desk every Monday morning. Researchers publishing in Psychological Science found that writing gratitude letters consistently elevated the mood of the writer, not just the recipient. The act of sitting down, recalling a specific kindness, and articulating its value in deliberate sentences produced measurable improvements in the writer's own sense of well-being. The 1950s housewife did not have the study. She had the habit, and the habit delivered the same result, week after week, for decades. What is striking is not that the research confirmed the benefit. What is striking is that the 1950s homemaker did not need the confirmation. She had inherited a practice that encoded the benefit structurally, the way a good recipe encodes nutrition without requiring the cook to understand biochemistry. The ritual of weekly correspondence was not designed as a mood intervention. It was designed as a social obligation. But because it was designed well, it delivered something extra to the woman performing it, a regular, reliable experience of her own generosity and attention. That is not a small thing. Consider what the recipient experienced. A letter arrived in the afternoon post. The envelope was cream-colored, addressed in a familiar hand. The recipient recognized the handwriting before she read the return address. She opened it at the kitchen table, or in the parlor, or standing at the front door because she could not wait. Inside was a note that mentioned something specific: the blue casserole dish, the particular way the roses on the table smelled, the moment after dinner when everyone laughed. Someone had paid attention. Someone had remembered. That memory, committed to paper, was the gift inside the gift. There is something the digital world cannot replicate, and it is not the words. It is the object. A handwritten note is a physical thing that was touched by the person who wrote it. The paper held under their hand. The pen pressed with a particular weight. The envelope sealed, addressed, carried to a mailbox. People kept these notes. They kept them in shoe boxes, in the backs of drawers, in the small wooden boxes that sat on their bedside tables. Decades later, they read them again. A text message from 1954 does not exist. A handwritten note from 1954 might still be in someone's attic right now. Speed is the enemy of meaning. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a structural one. When a gesture costs nothing, it communicates nothing. A 2-second text message sent from a phone while standing in a parking lot carries the weight of the effort it required, which is essentially zero. The recipient knows this. They feel it, even if they cannot articulate it. The 1950s thank you note cost time, attention, a 3-cent stamp, and the physical act of walking to a mailbox. That cost was not a burden. It was the signal. The effort was the message. By July 2026, we have arrived at the logical endpoint of the speed over meaning trajectory. AI systems generate condolence messages, birthday greetings, and thank you responses on behalf of people who cannot find the time or words to write their own. The automation is efficient. It is also, in the most precise sense of the word, meaningless. It communicates nothing about the sender, because the sender was not present in its creation. The 1950s homemaker, sitting at her writing desk with her fountain pen and her Crane & Co. stationery, was present in every word. That presence was the entire point. Here is what a handwritten note actually costs in the summer of 2026. You need a piece of paper, which you may have to hunt for. You need a pen that works, which may take 2 tries. You need a stamp, which currently costs 68 cents and requires a trip to the post office or a planned-ahead order online. And you need 10 minutes of uninterrupted thought. That is the entire investment. And because that investment is now so unusual, so countercultural, so quietly defiant of the digital world around it, the person who receives that envelope feels something that no push notification has ever once produced. There is a principle at work here that the 1950s homemaker understood without needing a name for it. When something is rare, it carries weight. When something costs effort, it signals that the recipient was worth that effort. A text message costs the sender nothing, and the recipient feels exactly that. But an envelope that arrives in a real mailbox, addressed in real handwriting, containing a real sentence written specifically for one specific person, that envelope says something a text message is constitutionally incapable of saying. It says, "I stopped. I thought of you. I chose paper over convenience." That is the scarcity principle, and it has never stopped being true. When we set aside the rules of written acknowledgment, we did not simply lose a charming old custom. We lost the machinery. Think of what the thank you note actually did inside a community. It confirmed that a gesture had been received and valued. It closed the loop between the giver and the receiver. It gave the giver a reason to give again. Without that loop closing reliably, people stop giving, stop hosting, stop extending themselves because they genuinely cannot tell whether it mattered. The silence that replaced the note was not neutral, it was erosive. Communities that stop acknowledging each other quietly stop caring for each other, and nobody marks the exact moment it happened. Here is the misconception I want to address directly, because I hear it often. People look back at the strict etiquette codes of the 1950s and they say, "Those rules were suffocating. Those rules were rigid. Those rules needed to go." And I understand the instinct, but I want to ask a follow-up question that almost nobody asks. What did we build to replace the function those rules performed? Because the rules were not the point. The acknowledgement was the point. The rules were simply the reliable delivery mechanism for the acknowledgement. We threw away the delivery mechanism and assumed the acknowledgement would somehow keep arriving on its own. It did not. One of the things I find most quietly brilliant about the 1950s note-writing tradition is what it did for the people who found words difficult. The introverts. The women who were not naturally eloquent. The daughters who froze at a blank page. The formula solved that problem completely. You did not need to be clever. You did not need to be poetic. You needed to be prompt, specific, and warm in that exact order. Acknowledge the gift. Name what it meant. Express forward warmth. 3 steps every time for every occasion. The structure was not a cage. It was a scaffold. It held you up until you found your footing. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The practice was genuinely equal in a way that very few social customs ever managed to be. A first-class stamp in 1954 cost 3 cents. Crane & Co. Stationery was the aspirational gold standard. Yes, but a plain sheet of good white paper from the 5 and dime served the same purpose. The formula required no special education, no particular gift for language, no expensive materials. Every woman with 3 cents, a working pen, and the willingness to sit down for 10 minutes could participate fully and correctly. The rules were strict, but they were not exclusive. That is rarer than it sounds. There is one more gift hidden inside the thank you note tradition that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most valuable one of all. To write a specific, meaningful note, you had to pay attention while the thing was happening. You had to notice the color of the casserole dish. You had to remember the name of the dessert the hostess made. You had to hold the detail in your mind long enough to get home and write it down. The act of future note writing trained women to be present in the moment before the moment was even over. Attention was not a byproduct of gratitude. Attention was the prerequisite for it. When you knew you would have to write about the evening later, you looked at it differently while it was still happening. You noticed the way the hostess had arranged the centerpiece. You noticed which fork she used first. You noticed the particular shade of the china. Noticing became a habit, and the habit became a form of respect. To notice someone's effort is to honor it. To write that noticing down and mail it across town is to honor it twice. The note was not just a social obligation. It was proof that you had been genuinely present. And in a world that was already beginning to move too fast, that proof mattered enormously. Your grandmother may have kept two things on the same shelf in the same quiet corner of her kitchen: a recipe box and a stationery drawer. I want you to think about what those two objects have in common. Both required her to pay close attention to the people around her. The recipe box held what her family loved to eat. The stationery drawer held the means to tell the people in her life that she had noticed them. Both were archives of careful attention. Both were forms of love made practical and repeatable. And both, in most households today, have quietly disappeared from the shelf where they used to live. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. I want to be honest about something, because this channel has never been interested in pretending the past was perfect. The 1950s had real constraints on women's lives, real limitations, real inequalities that deserved to change. But here is what I cannot let pass without comment. When the rules of acknowledgment went out, nothing came in to replace their function. We did not build a new system for closing the loop between givers and receivers. We did not find a new mechanism for making people feel seen. We simply stopped, and the quiet cost of that stopping has been accumulating ever since, in communities that feel less connected, in gestures that feel less valued, in people who quietly stop extending themselves because they cannot tell whether it matters anymore. So here is the practical truth I want to leave you with, because this is not a video about nostalgia for its own sake. The three-part formula that every 1950s homemaker knew by heart works exactly as well in 2026 as it did in 1954. Acknowledge the specific thing. Name what it meant to you specifically. Express forward warmth. That is it. You do not need Crane & Co. stationery. You do not need a fountain pen. You need a piece of paper, a working pen, a 68-cent stamp, and 10 minutes. The rule needs no updating. It needs only revival. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. It has always still worked. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. The women who wrote these notes were not performing politeness for its own sake. They were doing something far more sophisticated. They were maintaining the invisible connective tissue of a community, one cream envelope at a time. They knew that a gesture unacknowledged is a gesture that will not be repeated. They knew that the loop had to close, or the relationship would quietly fray. They knew it the way they knew to set the table before guests arrived and to stand when an elder entered the room. They knew it because someone had taken the time to teach them, and because they had taken the time to learn. When I think about the women who sat down at their writing desks on Tuesday mornings in 1954, I do not think about women who were confined to domestic life. I think about women who understood something profound about how human communities actually hold together. They understood that acknowledgment is not optional, that gratitude, expressed specifically and promptly, is the mortar between the bricks of any relationship. They built something invisible and irreplaceable, note by note, envelope by envelope, for decades. And when the culture decided those rules were old-fashioned and let them go, it did not realize until much later what had been holding the wall up. Good manners, remember, even when we forget. I would love to know if you have a memory of this. Maybe your mother sat at a desk like this one. Maybe your grandmother kept personalized stationery in a drawer you were not supposed to open. Maybe you remember being handed a note card as a child and told to write before you were allowed to go outside and play. Leave that memory in the comments, because those stories are exactly what this channel exists to keep alive. If you want to go deeper, I have a stationery guide linked below that walks through exactly what a well-stocked 1950s writing desk looked like and how to build a simple modern version of your own. And if this felt like the kind of video worth coming back for, I hope you will subscribe. There is so much more where this came from.